Kawczynski to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howarth. I beg to move that this House has considered cremation of infants in England. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Howarth, and I have to say that speaking as a father, I don't think there can be anything worse in life than the loss of a child. And I wanted to raise the issue with the Minister and with fellow parliamentarians, the tragedy that some of my constituents have faced when they lost a child in infancy and were told that by the crematorium in Shrewsbury that they would not receive any ashes of that child. They obviously decided, rather than the traditional burial, they decided to have their child cremated and were told that there would be no ashes. Mr. Howarth, I'm sure you can appreciate that under those circumstances, when the families have been through such a traumatic experience as losing a child just a few days previously in some cases, their state of mind was such that it was not an optimum situation for them to be as robust in challenging that information. And some of them went along with the cremation under those circumstances, but there was a lack of clarification in some instances. This is clearly unacceptable. And I pay tribute to BBC Radio Shropshire for the tremendous work that they've done over the last year. I was first notified of this tragedy a year ago, and I pay tribute to BBC Radio Shropshire, and in particular Nick Southall, the Radio Shropshire senior reporter, who has doggedly persevered with this story, and not just in Shropshire, but also around the rest of England. We are obviously starting to hear anecdotal evidence from other parts of our country where this not too dissimilar situation has occurred. This is not a situation peculiar to Shrewsbury. We are getting evidence of this happening in other parts of England, and I look forward to hearing from honourable members their perspectives. I would also like to about this was to contact the leader of the council, Keith Barrow. We now have a new authority in Shropshire, a unitary authority, which has taken over the running of our council, and the crematoria in question and the difficulties were predominantly under a previous administration before we made the changes to unitary authority. But Keith Barrow, the leader of the council, has done a superb job, and he called for... I will give way.
For giving way. I wonder if you'd just explain what the excuse that was given by the crematoria was, and maybe he's going to come on to that.
Yep. Yes, I will come on to...
By the crematoria was, and maybe he's going to come on to that.
Yep. Yes, I will come on to certainly some of the findings from the report a little bit later on in my speech, but I'd like to thank him for that intervention. I'd like to thank the chairman of the report, Mr. David Jenkins, who has a lot of experience in local government, who is an independent expert. Mr. Jenkins, David Jenkins, and his research assistant, Mr. John Doyle, have spent an inordinate amount of time, and I have to say with great sensitivity and professionalism and caring, in engaging with many of my constituents and hearing at first hand some of the trauma that they have experienced. Before the general election, Mr. Howarth, I met with some of my constituents in the church in Shrewsbury, and it was one of the most emotional meetings I think I have ever experienced in the decade that I have been the Member of Parliament for Shrewsbury. And I made those parents certain promises. I promised them that they would have a meeting with the Minister, that there would be a formal parliamentary debate in the House of Commons on this issue, and, most importantly of all, if there were aspects of this report that I considered to be relevant for Parliament to investigate and scrutinise with a view to changing legislation or updating it and modernising it, then those considerations would be aired and we as parliamentarians would have the opportunity of debating those points and making recommendations. So I'm very pleased that the 3 promises I've made to those parents I am in the process of trying to fulfill. And I'd like at this stage to pay tribute to the Minister. She is new in her post, and a very good decision, if I may say so, by the Prime Minister appointing her. What I'd like to say is that we brought some of the parents, and they weren't all from Shrewsbury, they weren't all from Shropshire, they were from other parts of England. And last week we met with the Minister, and I felt that the Minister was genuinely very interested in hearing what they had to say. I think she was moved. I'm sure she will speak for herself. But the way in which she interacted with those constituents, I was extremely impressed with, and I'd like to thank her very much for her time and consideration and that of her officials. Following on from the meeting with my honourable friend, we went to number 10 Downing Street, and we presented a petition of over 63,000 petitioners who have contributed to the petition from all over our country, and that was submitted at number 10 Downing Street. I would also like to refer to my honourable friend, the member for Ludlow, because I'm aware from my neighbour, the member of Ludlow, who is a minister, who as a minister is not able to participate in this debate, that he has taken an interest in this issue since the Emstrey crematorium serves his constituents in South Shropshire. One of those babies whose remains were not returned to the parents was baby Kate, who suffered a tragic, avoidable death in 2009 following a complex midwifery delivery at Ludlow Community Hospital. The member for Ludlow supports this campaign to prevent similar suffering for other parents, and I wanted the Minister to know that my honourable friend feels equally passionately as I do about this issue, but being a minister at the Ministry of Defence, he is unable to participate in this debate. He wanted me to get that on the record for him. Now, I know that other honourable members will wish to speak, so I'm going to concentrate now just on some of the recommendations that I have picked out from the report when I have read it, and also the points that have been specifically reinforced in my mind by the interactions from my own constituents. There may be other points of view from other parliamentarians, but these are the specific points from the report that my constituents from Shrewsbury wanted me to raise. Firstly, they believe there ought to be an inspector for crematoria throughout England, and that this should be a full-time position. My understanding is that there is a part-time inspector for crematoria in Scotland, but they only have 50 crematoria in that jurisdiction. We have over 250 in England, and many of my constituents believe there ought to be a formal independent inspector who can inspect crematoria and who can ensure, and we live in a society obviously where there are ombudsmen, there are regulators, and many aspects of government policy, government activity are quite rightly regulated and overseen by independent inspectors. They believe that if you're going to have a uniform level of service, professionalism across all crematoria, there needs to be an independent inspector who will be able to make investigations, go and see the crematoria and make sure that the standards comply with what is expected. They also expect that the crematoria have to report to the inspector if they find a case whereby they are not confident that ashes have been created. And this is very important because it's a proactive step that the facility in question, in our case, Emstrey Crematoria, would have to, if there is a chance that for some reason or other they believe that ashes have not been produced or cannot be produced, they have to proactively inform the inspector that is the case so that the inspector has that on the record. I would at this juncture, Mr. Howarth, like to say that I have inspected M Street Crematoria in Shrewsbury, spent an afternoon there, and they have invested a lot of money subsequently